Hey everybody, welcome to Foreign Radio. I'm your host, Memo. Before we dive in, I have a little bit of housekeeping to do for this episode. First, the guest has requested to remain anonymous. They've done this because they want to separate their previous experience as a high-level U.S. government intelligence insider with their current political beliefs and business ventures. Now, I understand in some journalistic circles, publishing and quoting anonymous sources is seen as a credibility risk. However, I'm not a journalist, but I still want to uphold certain standards and quality for my own work. The guest has provided me evidence of their identity prior to recording, and through some research, to the best of my ability, I am confident that this person is who they say they are. Second, the episode was recorded on April 9th, so any reference to policies and current events may no longer be relevant or have changed. Lastly, Foreign Radio is a podcast about travel and life abroad. However, the guest writes exclusively about politics and economics, and the conversation leans heavily in that direction. So I have edited out some content that I just feel strays too far from the purpose of this podcast. However, what the guest has to say is very relevant and important. So I'm adding some supplemental videos for anybody who wants to dive deeper into what this guest has to say. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Foreign Radio, episode 3. Today we have the synonymous William A. Finnegan. William is a former national security insider turned business exec and writer, known for his sharp, unapologetic commentary on politics, policy, and personal freedom. A political appointee of George W. Bush, William spent 5 years in the Pentagon following 9/11, held a national security clearance, and worked with both diplomatic and military leaders across the globe. He's briefed presidents, testified before Congress, and sat in on Gang of 8 intelligence briefings. William publishes 2 rapidly growing Substack newsletters. The first is a long Memo, which helps everyday people make sense of an increasingly chaotic political world. And the second, Borderless Living, a guide to legally and intelligently building a life beyond borders. His decision to prepare a personal exit strategy from the U.S., both financially and physically, is rooted in years of analyzing geopolitical risk, policy shifts, and the tightening of systems before the gates close. His approach isn't theoretical. It's deeply informed, pragmatic, and already in motion. For anyone thinking about how to gain more autonomy in an increasingly unpredictable world, William brings a wealth of experience to the table. Thank you, William, for being here. I wanted to speak with you. I feel that you present a unique perspective and you sort of embody like a certain type of person these days that's looking to move abroad, right, for political reasons. And you paint a pretty bleak picture of the political environment in the US on your Substacks. With your understanding of political history, your in-depth knowledge of political science and the philosophies that underpin the US Bill of Rights, and with your high level of practical experience in the US government, what is your current assessment of where the US is headed? And how does that deviate from sort of the historical trends?
Sure. There's a lot in that question, so let me take it apart. I know lately I'm like Mr. Happy Fun Guy, right? In all the things that I write and all the things that I say. I will say this with respect to that first as kind of like a prologue, perhaps. Colleagues of mine who worked in Trump 1.0 attempted to warn me about what Trump 2.0 would look like. And as much as I love and trust those colleagues, I couldn't fathom what unfolded, even though they told me this is what would unfold. And so now here I am going, wow, you were not only right, but if anything, you understated what was about to unfold. So I can appreciate the disorientation that many Americans feel, where basically they're like, hey, I didn't vote for all this, right? Even those that supported Trump. I was not someone who supported Trump, but even those that are supporting Trump or had supported Trump are now looking like, look, man, I didn't vote for you to blow up my 401k. I didn't vote for you to make everything 5 times more expensive. I didn't vote for this. I think there's a lot of disorientation in the United States at the moment. And I think one of the best people talking on this issue was someone who was there at the beginning, Barbara Walter. Okay, Dr. Barbara Walter. And her work was really good. It's still really good. I shouldn't say that it isn't. It's still really good. And she has this really accessible TED Talk for people, who are listening, where you can go on YouTube, type in Barbara F. Walter TED Talk, and you will get the TED Talk. And she talks about what is the real cause of instability. And her hypothesis is this notion of what I would call sectarian identity conflict, that when the conditions within the country create this sectarian identity, I'm this, you're not, therefore we're in conflict, the chance of civil war and collapse astronomically goes up in terms of probability. I think that's true. And so in her TED Talk, she says, look, we're seeing a lot of these sectarian identification signals, anocracy, erosion of institutions, erosion in truth in the United States. Now, when she gives that talk, forgive me, I think it's like 5 years ago that she gives that TED Talk. So this is not like she gave it last week, looked out the window, gave it last week and said, whoa, shit, the world's exploding. That was not not how this worked. So a lot of us look at this and are like, wow, okay. So democracy and, government generally is pretty fragile, and it's predicated on combination of economics, reputation, political identity, right? We start getting a sense of, okay, well, what really causes state failure? So I look at the United States. In the first Trump term, you have an erosion of democratic norms, an erosion of institutions, a challenging of America's historical institution, the courts, the cabinet, the bureaucratic process. Okay, I mean, everyone's like, I hate the bureaucracy, I hate red tape. Well, let me tell you, a lot of that also serves to just slow everything the hell down so that we can gain some degree of consensus in the United States at the top level. Okay, yeah, democracy may be inefficient, and autocracy is real quick. It's also swift, sure, and without appeal, which is something that most of us aren't particularly interested in.
Yeah.
Right. so anyway, so you have Trump won and things jump the rails. Again, one of my friends warned about this, publicly warned about this, was on TV. Olivia Troy publicly warns about this. There will be violence. There will be unrest. There will be, I know you can't see it, but this is going to happen. This is who these people are. She calls it out about 2 weeks before January 6th happens on national television. I'm one of those people where I'm like, normally I'm with you, but are you serious on this? I mean, yeah, I can see protests and and I'm like, but we're going to have like clashing with the cops and shooting and whatnot going on. And she's, yes. And I'm like, wow, okay, I don't see it. But, and then January 6th happens. And while it's happening, I'm like, wow, well, shit, you were right. Here we are. Okay. And so while there was all of the reconciliation after January 6th, reconciliation in terms of trying to reconcile our belief system with what the hell we just saw happen, not reconciliation with the January 6th insurrectionists. And I don't call it a riot. That was an insurrection. Okay. There are differences and words do matter. That was an insurrection against the United States government. It was not a riot. Okay. And I watched that event happen and I'm like, whoa, things are seriously broken. And for the first time ever, I gave legitimate thought to what if he doesn't go? Now, I felt pretty confident because I knew many of the leaders in the Pentagon. I'm like, well, they're not going to sign on to this. And oftentimes the military is the final backstop of coups in preventing them from happening. Okay. It's very difficult to take over a country with the military not behind the insurrectionists. Okay. And so I'm like, well, this may all boil down to whether or not our commanders follow their gut versus follow the law. And I'm like, that's a very interesting position to put these men in. And Milley, to his credit, followed his gut and not the law. Okay. The things that he did, in my opinion, many of the things that he's confessed to are unlawful. They were totally the right thing to do, but they were unlawful. They were totally the right thing to do to protect the United States, but they were not lawful within the context of Title 10. Okay. So he made the right call. I'm not giving him crap over that. But I'm like, I look at this and I'm like, this is where we placed these commanders. They had to choose between doing what they believed was the spirit of their oath in defending the Constitution versus following the strict law with respect to the chain of command. For whatever reason, Donald Trump decides to depart. Hooray for us. And Biden comes in and he correctly frames, look, we almost lost the plot and we got to put the pin back in the grenade. Right. And so he spends 4 years trying to do that relatively ineffectively, I'd say. And I have a lot of respect for the president, President Biden. And I worked with him when he was Senator Biden on the Foreign Relations, and Armed Services Committee and Intelligence Committee, and even the Judiciary Committee. Smart guy, didn't see eye to eye with him most of the time. Oddly enough, by the time he left office as president, I was more or less lockstep with the guy on most of the important issues with respect to maintaining the integrity of American institutions. Because something that changed, and part of the reason why I left the Republican Party in 2012, when I was a partisan, we'd argue over mechanisms and means by and large, not what's the right thing to do. Okay. So, I know this seems ridiculous today. Let's take taxes, right? Republicans don't argue over taxes anymore. Apparently, we love taxes as Republicans, right? If we're Republicans, we're like, yeah, tariffs and jacking up taxes sounds awesome. When's the last time you ever heard that come out of the mouths of Republicans? Right? So we have a massive tariff scheme, which for all intents and purposes has increased the price of goods between 25 and 100%. That's a tax. Combined with, what is it, a couple of days ago, the president, I think we should soak the rich. Excuse me? What party is this again? Well, back in the day when, that was an issue, Democrats and Republicans argued about taxation, largely to argue about what are the distributive priorities of the federal government. Okay. Republicans believe predominantly in national defense. They believed predominantly in, if there are going to be wealth transfers to states, the states should figure out how to distribute those transfers, not the federal government, right? So it was arguments about means. That is not what the arguments are about now, to the extent there are arguments at all, right? The president is, I won, you lost, I'm king, you're not, here's my boot, bend over. That is a fundamental shift in how things have been conducted. And unfortunately, guys like Chuck Schumer are still standing there like ducks and thunder, believing this is still the old boys club and everything can get worked out. That's why people are so mad with him over the budget bill. Well, I see I had to surrender because fighting would have been, my God, the government might have shut down. Yeah, that was the whole point, right? So I look at everything and I'm like, wow, everything is fundamentally broken. Now, a lot of people believe Trump leaves, dies, chokes on a cookie, whatever. Everything goes away. That's not what's going to happen. We told every country in the world that we are now running on the basis of whatever we feel is correct, might makes right, and you all can just piss the hell off. Despite the president's best effort to destroy the country in 90 days, it's just not going to be possible. He's doing a lot of damage. I got to tell you, I don't know whether to vomit or give him a golf clap for the level of damage he's been able to commit. But these are not repairable things that can be fixed because one guy leaves office. Okay. The United States has gotten a full-throated taste of authoritarianism, and apparently, other than the stock market, a good chunk of America likes it. And that is a fundamental shift as well in how Americans behave and how United States economic and foreign policy behaves. I mean, the president has stood up and made utterly defamatory statements about our allies. So the brand damage that the president has done to the United States, even if the tariffs go away tomorrow, even if he stops threatening Canada and Denmark and Panamanians tomorrow, the amount of brand damage we've done for ourselves, that sting is not going to go away instantly. So that's why I say to people, look, Trump leaves, gets hit by a bus, smited down in Congress, whatever scenario you want to concoct for yourself, that doesn't change the trajectory of where we're at. Because, hey, we don't know that the next guy isn't going to be worse. And Congress, the Republicans in Congress seem pretty committed to this anocracy project. So I look at this and I say to myself, okay, I'm not going to live the remaining years of my life under this. And I know how this story ends. We are going to implode. So for the next decade, opportunity is not going to be in the United States. Even if we turn it around on some of these issues, opportunity for whatever reason, and this is unprecedented, the world's largest dominant power up and commits suicide in the span of roughly 3 months. Now that fuse is going to take a while to burn, but it's going to burn, which I get a lot of blowback on this. But I'm like, hashtag change my mind. You show me contraindicative evidence that I'm wrong on this. This is why I wrote the article about leaving wasn't the plan. And also a version of it is what was published in Persuasion. And I'm grateful to them, to Yasha and Sam, for allowing that.
Sorry to interject here. What does
no, of
leaving
course.
solve for you? Because I know you've.
What does leaving solve?
Yeah, like you've drawn trends between your this current moment in time and like what we saw in World War II with Jews leaving Europe. You've quoted Billy Wilder saying the optimists died in the gas chambers and the pessimists have pools
in Beverly Hills. Yep. That's a chilling quote, by the way.
Yeah, no,
I have Stuart Rochester to thank largely for that quote, but anyway.
So what does leaving solve for you? You've talked about totalitarianism, emerging in the U.S. So why leave?
First, I think it's important.
Is that the answer?
I think it's important to acknowledge a couple of things. First, that nationalism doesn't work in your interest. Okay, so the future belongs to the free. I've said that multiple times. What it solves is we're at this point in history where you don't need to be tied to location. Now, if you're a plumber, okay, problematic. If you're a steel worker, if you're a factory worker, you have less mobility option. But for many of us that are educated and professionals, we can do our jobs from anywhere. So let's make it more simple. Let's say there are only 2 countries in the world, A and B, and both countries need what you do. And A taxes you at 70% and B taxes you at 30%. And all you got to do is cross a line to make yourself more wealthy. What do? Well, you move, right? What the solving, and again, I think part of this also, there are a lot of people who want to leave because they hate what's happening. I have that motivation too, but I'm also looking at this going, look, my ancestors came to the United States for opportunity. Okay. Now, for many, I'm the descendant of Italian immigrants. Many of those people came, they were dirt poor, they couldn't speak English, right? Everybody's seen Once Upon a Time in America and Godfather and things like that, right? All right. That wasn't quite my family's experience, my ancestors' experience. They had businesses. They were able to speak English when they got here, and they became businessmen in the United States. And they fled Italy because basically Italy couldn't provide for its populations. Okay, so people immigrate from Italy to the United States, to Brazil, to other places in South America for opportunity. Because of American exceptionalism, we focus a lot on the linkage between America and Italy. But Italians immigrated all over the world, largely because Italy couldn't sustain them, all right? And they went to other places. In the case of Italy, the Italian government didn't decide, let's blow up the entire economy and the entire fabric of, our goddamn bureaucracy and start that exodus. That's not how it happened. But the effect is the same. The government and the country was not providing for the needs of its citizens. Now, what I've been calling the Great American Exodus, which is starting, which I believe is going to continue for the next decade, are people like me going, okay, this isn't working. And technology and capital and the ability to travel creates an environment where the future belongs to those who are willing to put nationalism aside, which is really rough for Americans because America is not a country, it's a identity constituent. The only other countries in the world where we are French, right? You will definitely see, that kind of like it's in our DNA type of thing, right? But nationalism is a really strong thing to get away from. But I do think that for me, and I think part of the reason why borderless living and some of the other things I'm writing resonate is people feel at an instinctive level, this is broken. Opportunity is going to be found elsewhere. It's time to look for the door. Okay. And so, what does it solve for me? One, I don't want to live under authoritarianism or anocracy, if that's what our end state's going to be. Two, over the next decade, US ability to control economics is going to change. So economic opportunity is going to be elsewhere. I don't want my children to grow up under a collapsing regime. I'm at the end of my careers and lives and whatnot, right? I'm in my 50s. So I have another 25, 30, maybe 35 years, although I don't know, right? If Elon Musk decides to put us all in the silicon chip, maybe we all live forever, right? That's his grand plan. But, assuming, right, assuming health and everything continues, my kids are working and can't afford housing in the United States. That's not true everywhere in the world. I mean, one of the lies we tell ourselves as Americans is, well, we're like the smartest fucking people who ever lived. So if we can't figure this out, clearly there are no solutions. Well, Europeans have figured out how to provide universal health care and not have eggs cost $28 a piece. And, I mean, there are other systems where you can go live and not be so miserable. I mean, that's just a fact. Okay.
Yeah, and
And s-
that's a huge topic these days, right? I mean, it's all over
right.
Substack.
There's this great Substack. I'm sure you've seen it. Greg Garrison's Living Elsewhere.
Yeah, I just
He wrote
interviewed him last week.
Okay, Greg's a fascinating guy.
Yeah.
And I have recommended Greg, and we don't know each other well, but we bump into each other a lot. But he had this piece where he was talking about how he's at the grocery store, and the woman in front of him was buying a month's worth of food, and she spent 200 euros, which for those in the United States listening, it's about $230. Okay, at the current exchange rate. I don't know about you. I could in the United States, I could barely feed the family of four for less than $250 a week.
Yeah.
And their food is different. So chocolate's a big issue between the United States and the Europeans. And everyone remarks European chocolate tastes different. Yes, it does. And there's a reason for that. And for any of you who like Hershey bars, the reason why American chocolate tastes the way it does is because Hershey figured out a way to make milk shelf stable. And the way you make milk shelf stable is you sour it in a specific way, and then it doesn't degrade. And that's why American chocolate tastes the way it does, because milk chocolate in America essentially is made with sour, spoiled milk. Now, I'm saying putting spoiled in air quotes, it's not dangerously spoiled. That is not what the European Union is like. We are not allowing that shit in the United States, period. Okay. Now, it's funny because I saw Lutnick on CNBC or one of these stupid shows, and he's like, well, they have all these barriers. They won't allow American meat. They won't allow American. Yeah, you know why? Because they have their own version of the FDA, and they're like, yeah, we're not allowing this cockamamie way that you do food. By the way, we do that in the United States. The FDA doesn't allow a lot of food into the United States because of traceability, because of the ability to monitor, because of the ability to test. Okay. There's all kinds of regulations countries have. And the European Union has a totally different approach to food than the United States in terms of organic and, what constitutes best practices and things like that. And so people, they go to Europe and they're like, wow, everything tastes like really good and really different. Well, yeah, they got an entirely different approach to farming that results in better quality at a lower cost.
Yeah, we see something similar here in Belize too, especially with the beef. We've
Right.
recently discovered like it's all just it's not, I doubt it's organic, but it's all grass fed. Like you
Right.
can see the cows out in the fields grazing.
Right.
There's no factory farming here. There's some places up in Spanish Lookout with the Mennonites. We feel like my wife and I, our health has improved since moving here. For sure, we've overcome some ailments and little
I'm
things that have
sure
been
that's
bothering us.
true. And I've heard that over and over and over. I lost weight. I still eat like a king, And again, I'm not like, this is not an indictment of the American FDA or anything like that. But I'm saying that, other countries have figured other things out. America does not have a lock on the solution to everything on everything in the world.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no, how can you leave it? I basically hear three arguments. The first one that I hear from people, honestly, that are like me is, yeah, I'm looking for the door too. How do I do that?
Yeah.
The second argument I hear is, you picked a fine time to leave me, Lucille, right? Where you have to stay and help us fight. How can you just leave the rest of us behind? I'm not unsympathetic to that argument, except to say, look, I did my bit for God and country. I've earned my button and I've earned my right to figure out what happens next in my life. Okay. So it's not abandonment. It's, I have to do what's best for me. And I will continue, I don't know what your journey is or what your story is or what readers or listeners may be thinking. I do not anticipate walking into an American embassy and in some grand gesture of defiance, lighting my passport on fire. Okay. So I don't stop being an American because I live somewhere else. Even if I do renounce my citizenship, I'm never going to be accepted as Italian or Irish or French or Belizean or Chilean. It doesn't matter where I go live. They're always going to spot me as American. Right. So my cultural ties aren't going to end because I move. But I'm like, it is time to stop thinking that the only option I have is to stay where I am. If you want opportunity, if you want new horizons, and one of the things I think, is different. I'm sure it's the case for you since you made the decision to leave. Those of us who have traveled extensively have a much different worldview than those who have never left where they grew up. Okay. And there is a pluralism function that operates on you when you travel a lot. You have to deal with other people. You have to deal with other cultures. You have to, even for the time you're just there, you have to assimilate. You have to figure out, where's the grocery store, or how do I use the train? But it's funny. I joked with my wife. I'm like, holy shit, all that time we spent in high school about learning how to use the train table. I mean, that shit winds up actually being useful when you're in France. Okay. And it's funny too, because we were on a cruise. This is the first time we did a cruise from Barcelona to Italy. And when we came back the other way, we took a train from Barcelona to Paris. Now, anyone who studied French probably has used the same textbooks I used, where they had their cahier and their textbook and Le Monde and the whole nine yards. Okay, so they always drew these pictures of like, here's what the boulangerie looks like, here's what the farms look like, blah, blah, blah. And every time I go to Paris, I'm like, I never see any of that shit. We go on this train ride and I look out the window and I'm like, oh my God, it's the textbook. Right? As we're outside of Paris. And I was like, oh my God, I actually can use the knowledge I learned. And these people speak slow enough. I can actually like get it almost as to what they're saying. Now, of course, they all look at me and they're all duolingual. And they very patiently listen to me and then they smile and then they reply back, I speak English, and reply to me in English. Okay, but they appreciate the effort at some level, I'm guessing. I can somewhat speak French. I can somewhat speak Italian. I can read both languages reasonably well. I can even, read and I'm pretty facile in Latin. So I can kind of, understand what people are telling me, even if I'm not familiar with that language, as long as it's a Latin-based language. And so that's why I've joked. I said, by outside of like the State Department and the diplomatic corps, I'm like an idiot savant by comparison to most Americans. Right. But I don't kid myself either. I know I moved to France or Italy or Spain or Portugal, I'm completely hosed. Whereas most Europeans, most South Americans, they speak multiple languages and do so at a vehicular level at the
Yeah.
minimum. And
Yeah.
many of them are just fluent.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because Gregory Garrettson, he's multilingual and he's a linguist. So we talked a lot about just how most of the world is actually like trilingual almost. And
Right.
even here in Belize, they're trilingual. It's English, Spanish, and Creole here, and everyone speaks it. So they're just like constantly code switching all the time. And you definitely feel like while English is the main language here in Belize, I talk about with him how they kind of speak it a little bit differently. The meanings behind things are different. But I mean, a lot of the times they're just, if they don't want you to really know what they're talking about, they'll just start speaking Creole to each other, and they pretty much know that like Whitey, no way he knows it, and if he does, well, it's like it's rare, you know.
Sure, fair enough, right? So there's always that degree of othering that's going on. This is a prediction as a former scholar, political scientist. If what I believe happens with the Great American Exodus happens, there will be an adjustment around the world as a consequence of that fact. Because Americans that leave, even, like people like me, will be very respectful of the cultures we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
But when millions of us move to Ireland or Italy or Canada, there's going to be a cultural impact on the places we land. So essentially, there'll be a spreading of American beliefs and values and culture as a consequence of that exodus.
So it's interesting you bring that up right now because you mentioned in your writing that you're considering Italy and you want to do
Yes.
citizenship. So you
Yep.
were invoking the jus
Jus
sanguinis.
sanguinis. Yeah, jus
Yeah, jus
sanguinis.
sanguinis. Sorry, my Latin isn't great. The timing of this, do you think Italy right now is anticipating this great American exodus, and that's why they're placing
The decree.
restrictions on
Yeah.
who they're accepting? Is this like a subtle, or maybe not so subtle, like fuck you to the US, being like, we don't want you,
It's
essentially?
it's funny. One of my readers commented on the article I wrote where Maloney's like, "We need more people in Italy." Basically, he wrote a joke. He goes, "We need more people in Italy." So then he said, so Africa says, "Okay, we'll come." And then Maloney says, "No, not you." Right. And then Tony in Bensonhurst, New Jersey, "I'll come." "No, not you either." And then the guy in Brazil, "I'll come." "No, not you either." To a certain extent, the Maloney government's policies appear to be at best schizophrenic, right? In terms of what they actually want. Now, Italy's facing a problem with declining birth rates and an aging population. And, they're trying to head off what they see as their future when looking like at a country like Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Italy has had I would argue, one of the most generous reclamation of citizenship programs of any country in the world, where basically they've said if your, descendants were Italians and your lineage was not broken where your grandfather or your great grandfather or whatever was born, but his parents had not become citizens before the time of that event, then you have a right of birthright citizenship in Italy. My belief about the Maloney decree is different than the advisors that I have and others I talk to where this is their business. So let me begin by stating that. I'll give you my belief and then I'll give you the advice that I've been told, and listeners can draw their own conclusions.
Okay.
My belief is that what they did does express a belief about who they actually want to allow to immigrate into the country. While Maloney may be, Donald Trump in Ferragamos instead of red hats, she is very much aligned with this. We hate Jews, we hate gays, we hate lesbians, we hate transsexuals. We want our beer cold, our TV loud, and everyone basically a heterosexual couple living in Italy. Right? That's how I would summarize Italian MAGA. So okay. There are other ways, by the way, to solve Italy's problems for somebody like me. But the notion of, well, you can't just be a passport of convenience. I think there is more than a kernel of truth there in the politics of that. what the government did doesn't seem to be all that legit legally. And initially, when the decree came down, what I reported is everything I'm hearing is this is very likely to be ratified by their parliament. Then 3 days later, all the evidence I got was this is very likely not to be ratified by parliament, because even the people who want immigration change are like, you can't just announce this and blurt this out at the 11th hour in the middle of the night. We got to have a discussion about this, right? So even those who want to see immigration change are really pissed, it sounds like, about the process under which this unfolded. But I'm a politician and a political scientist, not an Italian legal expert. So I look at this and go, okay, this is signal and not noise. And yes, something is going to fundamentally change. Now, is that in reaction to all these people that are likely to immigrate? If it is, they're trying to use like a sledgehammer when they should be using a scalpel. And I think the people who want to see immigration changed understand that. So there are some people who don't want to see any change. And then there are people who are like, okay, maybe some change. The people who want to see changes, there's a difference between immigrating to welfare and immigrating to work for any country. Okay. The reason why the United States had effectively open immigration for periods of time around the turn of the century is those people were immigrating to work, not to welfare. And the argument now with respect to immigration, legal or otherwise, in the United States is a general perception by the population, which is not accurate, that most people immigrate to welfare. And that is not legally or factually true in the United States. Illegal immigrants are not entitled to any federal benefits, essentially. Okay, I'm not going to go deep into the law. And even states that are generous, like where I live, and allow illegal immigrants to have access to state welfare, even that isn't 100%. So the vast majority of people who come to the United States are attempting to work, but the perception of most Americans is they come here to be sponges. And that's why they're so despised. Now, in the case of Italy and France and some other countries in Europe, the United Kingdom, the concern is about the loss of cultural identity, because those people actually are staying. They're immigrating and then they are staying and they are not assimilating. So that creates its own problems. And we definitely have had that in the United States. Predominantly immigrants coming from Mexico, Central and South America, not being fully integrated into American culture, right?
I mean, you see it here in Belize. There's little enclaves of North America. I mean, I live in one.
And then we joke, right? We call them American expat communities. No, basically, you're just all unassimilated and you don't like that nomenclature.
Yeah, it's like selective. You come here and you select the things you like, and then you just isolate yourself from the things that you don't. Which is
and that's not great. It's not great for any country, because nationalist identity is an important constituent of being a nation state. I can't remember if this made it into the piece or not. I know that for the persuasion piece I wrote, if Monty Python were writing this, he'd say, nobody ever suspects the Treaty of Westphalia, right? Instead of nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, nobody expects the Treaty of Westphalia, which, for those that don't get the reference, that is the treaty that essentially starts the whole idea of the nation state system we live under. Okay. And the entire idea of nationalism comes out of the outgrowth of the nation state system. I think Italy is changing. I don't think this decree is going to fly. Now, the advice I've been getting from everybody where this is their business is this decree is not going to fly. There is going to be dramatic legal resistance over this. The Italian courts, I've learned a lot about the Italian legal system, and honestly, I wish some of this was available in the United States. In Italian legal system, the judges don't have to wait for litigation to go, that's bullshit, we're not allowing that. So essentially, judges in Italy can act what we would say sua sponte. They don't have to wait for cases to be brought to them in order to determine something is or is not lawful. And so a lot of judges are already looking at this thing side-eye going, yeah, that doesn't look right. And are referring it to special court that deals with constitutional issues. And so there are going to be hearings, even if the decree is ratified. And everyone's belief is, okay, something may happen, but it isn't going to be this. And then the hardcore people are like, this isn't going to happen and nothing's really going to change, because the bottom line is Italy needs these people who are immigrating. That said, That's the specific case of Italy. Broadly, all these countries around the world are going to be forced with a difficult choice. On the one hand, they're going to want Americans that are leaving with money and jobs and companies and intellectual property and innovation, because all these other countries in the world lack that. There's no country other than the United States that has a surplus of smart, wealthy people, period. So they want that. It's very difficult to craft an immigration policy that says only that. Right? So as a guy who's made laws, it's pretty tough to write. You can only come in, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is why many countries have golden visa programs, in my opinion. That's essentially what they're trying to do. Okay. But even that isn't 100% of what they want, because, there are a lot of people who would be great for their society that aren't necessarily liquid with $1 million worth of capital. So they're going to have to figure it out. But I think all of these countries are being forced with a circumstance they've never considered before, which is they're going to have people who can immigrate to work knocking on their door. And one of the things, Sima, I'll tell you, I had no idea how difficult this all really was to do this correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I had heard stories, and I have been attesters to individuals who wanted to become American citizens, where I've written letters of recommendation and sat down with immigration officials and everything for individuals predominantly from the United Kingdom who wanted to immigrate to the United States and become US citizens or get their green cards or whatever. And I was stunned at how long it took for many of them, which was about a decade in almost every instance. Yeah, and like $100,000 worth of time and effort. Okay. And so I'm like, whoa, okay. So, but at the time, I was, I just kind of put that fact in the back of my head. Now that I'm looking at it, and like Italy, you want to hire people who know what they're doing, and you want to go, get Italian citizenship and everything. That is not a free process. And then you're actually going to go live there. I mean, now I'm not telling you anything you don't know. My wife and I and our family are like, unless it is absolutely dear to us, we are selling everything. We are not paying to move your desk at $40 a pound to Europe.
We did that. We moved a shipping container. It wasn't crazy. It was a big expense, though, I will say. Yeah, to anybody.
Okay. And
moving,
even
you
with
will
cutting
shell it,
everything down, I know we're going to have a shipping container of some kind. Okay. But people don't, and I've moved multiple times, and you're like, God, how the hell did I wind up with all this shit?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's like I sold half of it. How do I still have so much?
Right, exactly, right. And so, I mean, I have, so I'm not like quite, if it doesn't bring joy, get rid of it, right? There are some like real hardcore purists about this.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely am like, look, man, if I haven't used it in the last 90 days, it goes.
Yeah. You will bring stuff that you won't use. Like we now look at boxes and we're like, why did we bring that? We haven't even used it.
Absolutely.
It was a waste.
And you were deliberate trying to trim down.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. So
be liberal. You're pairing.
Well, I've decided, we're moving to wherever. We're not moving to the moon. We can buy it again. And that, quite frankly, may be cheaper. So I mean, because we have dogs and kids and whatnot, we predominantly have IKEA stuff. And not that we don't have some good stuff, we do, but we predominantly have a lot of IKEA stuff in the main areas. And I'm like, yeah, none of that's getting moved. There's an IKEA everywhere in the world.
Yeah, well, except Belize.
Okay, so then Belize is off the table.
Thing here.
All right, well, Belize is off the table for me then. As much as I like Belize, I've been to Belize, amazing beaches, been out to the Cays, done diving, amazing. Not moving to a place that doesn't have an IKEA. So that's a red line for me, I guess.
Speaking of countries of where you want to go, I do have a question. So I recently read an article from the BBC about, and you briefly mentioned this earlier, about German rearmament and their worry about Russia. And there's a lot of people considering Europe. Is Europe a safe bet right now? Are these concerns was this media clickbait hyperbole just to get views, or is there real concern here? And if there is a real concern, is then Europe a safe bet to move, right? To spend all that time, all that money moving to Europe only to have a looming threat from Russia?
Okay. There's a lot to unpack in this. The general answer I'd say is Europe is safe to move to, given what I believe to be the likely situation for the next 5 to 7 years. Okay. The longer answer goes like this. The Europeans have relied on the United States heavily for its defense, but Europe is by no means defenseless. The French have a potent deterrent force. Okay. They have nuclear weapons, they have top end gear. True story. So we're in Paris and there's the Arc de Triomphe. And my children are like, they shouldn't have any Arc de Triomphe. They surrendered. I'm like, one time in history, the French surrendered. And you've concluded they're all a bunch of wusses and cowards, huh? I'm like, let me tell you the real history of France. Okay. And oh, by the way, Gamelin had two choices: surrender or get annihilated in World War II. So it's not like he had a ton of choices. I said, I think you're judging France a bit too harshly. France today has the force de frappe, and their capabilities are strong. If Russia, for whatever reason, decided they wanted to attack and roll through the Fulda Gap like it's the good old days, that'll be the last thing they ever do. It probably will be the last thing for the entire world, because France will retaliate and will, in my opinion, will use nuclear weapons if necessary. And the Russians are fully aware of this. They have no illusions about France's desire to maintain territorial sovereignty. And Macron has stood up and said France is prepared to defend the entirety of Europe and NATO allies against all adversaries. Now, I interpreted that speech as being a smack at Trump, not Putin, in that moment. But it still applies. And France has been, France is like, we understand Putin, we work with him, we're going to deal with him, but we are not afraid of him. Germany's military is very potent. It's not very big, but it's potent. The real weakness for Europe is they don't have a military industrial complex. That's their weakness. Okay. They have frontline equipment. They have highly trained forces. They have highly disciplined leadership. The Russians cannot annex Germany or Europe by force. The Russians can put a lot of pressure on Europe because of energy demands. They can put a lot of pressure on Europe in terms of threats. But Europe has made a decision, and I'm not happy about it as an American, but I understand it as a tactician, that they have to build up their own forces. And for this $1 trillion they're going to buy, some of it is going to have to come from the United States, as much as they may hate that. Russia is a big force, and they have nuclear weapons. But here's the reality. They got their teeth kicked in by a country that effectively only has light mechanized infantry, predominantly is staffed by militia. The Europeans aren't going to just roll over. And the French have a nuclear deterrent. So do the British. So it would not be costless for Putin to try to roll into European territory, and their commitment to NATO. So, initially I had concerns about living in Europe. I don't think you're safer living in the United States versus living in Europe if what you're concerned about is military conflict. And it's just my spidey sense on it all.
Is it then time, if you can, as somebody with the income, with the flexibility to leave and the desire to leave, is it time to leave? And like, when would you consider it to be too late to leave?
Well, if you really have the capability and everything to move right now, you should do it, because there's an opportunity cost to waiting. Okay. There are such things called wait calculations. There's no advantage to waiting, because you're just denying yourself the opportunity on the other side. Remember, I'm like, look, we're leaving because we want more opportunity, not that we're fleeing something. So, there's the marshmallow test of, can you delay gratification? Well, that's not what I think is applicable here. So if you have the means to move, then you should start it, because if nothing else, why would you want to delay making your life better? Okay. But the broader question I think you're asking is when's time's up, right? On this. Yep. That's something I look at every day. It's fluid. just to be frank. Okay. Some days the clock moves in your favor, other days the clock doesn't move in your favor. If your main concern is whether or not you're going to be able to leave, then what you're paying attention to essentially is capital flight, innovation flight, and how bonkers does the president make trying to immigrate to other countries. Right? Those are your factors. My belief is that the fuse is lit and it's burning, and you're on borrowed time probably shortly after the midterm election. Okay, that's my belief. So, and even after the midterm election, your fear is not about other countries reacting to the United States, as it'll become clear to the United States what is happening. Okay. If the great exodus that I'm talking about happens, we're talking about as much money leaving as Trump vaporized off the stock market in the last 4 days. And everybody's having a nervous breakdown over that. Ostensibly, the market gains are on paper and could be recovered. People move. That's that.
Yeah.
Those are permanent losses. Okay. So the United States locking down capital, the United States, and here's something probably most people don't know, the United States does have the power and authority to deny US citizens leaving the United States. And you cannot present another country's passport as a US citizen attempting to egress the United States. That is a felony.
Interesting.
So if
Okay.
you're a US citizen and you are at the checkpoint and that CBP guy's like, passport, and I hand him my Italian passport instead of my US passport, I'm engaged in a crime.
Oh, okay.
Now, once I get out of the United States, I can use whatever passport I want. Okay. And when I come back to the United States, I can't use my Italian passport. If I'm a US citizen, I have to identify myself as such at the border, both ways. So what you could see is, and the mechanism is there, the law is there to deny US citizens leaving the United States for national security reasons.
I mean, we saw it at least in Canada during COVID.
Right.
If you weren't vaccinated, my wife didn't get vaccinated. She was pretty much pregnant with our 2 kids for all of COVID. And she didn't, feel comfortable getting vaccinated at that time. And the government, we essentially had to like sneak her out with a religious affidavit. That was the only way we could get her out, because
Okay,
the
so you're
government was just
familiar
like,
with
no,
some of the
you can't.
apparatus that exists about being
Yeah.
able to leave. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, my belief is that, well, at some point they're going to realize the innovation and capital flight leaving the United States. You saw all those professors leave Yale. Okay. It's open season. The entire world has realized it's open season on the bright and the innovative from the United States. I mean, that's the University of Toronto pulling those people. That's a huge coup for them. Okay. Toronto is a great school for history and politics and things like that. And they have a great international reputation. And I'm sure they're happy as a clam to have people like Timothy Snyder now on faculty. Okay.
So yeah, that's interesting. So it's not just people being pushed, away from circumstances. It's actually being drawn by
Right.
other
And so
countries
they're
who
like,
are now vying for,
right, exactly. Right.
their
And
attention.
eventually our policy focus could turn to that. Okay. Where they could realize that the brain drain and the money drain on the United States constitutes an existential threat to the continuation of the regime. Because, not to be flippant or pejorative about it, you can't have a nation of imbeciles and billionaires. Right?
Yeah.
So I tell you what, MAGA hat wearing guy, that guy doesn't go more than 20 miles from his house, let alone he's going to immigrate to France. That's not who the government's got to worry about. And the billionaires already have the ability to go wherever. And so they're backing for how long, who knows, but they're backing the regime because they think there's something to gain by it. So it's the people in the middle, again, immigration to work, not welfare, that they have to worry about. And so that's why I'm looking at it going, okay, I think, every day I look at the factors and I make a risk calculation and I'm like, which way is the clock moving? Now, for a while now, the clock has been more or less stuck around the midterm election. It used to be, in my opinion, to about the first end of the first quarter of 2027. I no longer believe that. I think, you have 18 to 20 months. If this is your plan, if you're trying to leave, if you want to pursue other options, I think you got 18 to 20 months. That's my read at the moment. And I don't think I'm being Pollyannish or reactionary in saying that. And these are not decisions, by the way, that should just be contemplated lightly. Because here's the realization I made: wherever I land, that's probably going to be the last place I ever live. I'm going to die in that country, which is not something, if you'd have told me when I raised my hand and took my oath to defend the Constitution, you wouldn't have been able to convince me of that fact at that time back in 2003. And yet here we are. But at the same time, honestly, when I went down that journey, I wouldn't have believed I'd be in Congress and the White House and the Parliament and, the United Nations and all the other places I went.
Well, that's a critical insight. I think that's important for people to understand. Just one last thing, if you can maybe just tell us a little bit more about Borderless Media LLC.
Yeah.
And I know you've got some subscriber content, so I don't want you to reveal too much.
Sure.
But if you can just maybe give a brief overview of what your sort of plans for that endeavor is.
Sure. So Borderless Media was created, and the idea, I realized I'm going to have to learn all these things and make all these connections and gain all this knowledge and insight. And being an entrepreneur, I was like, that's all going to have value. And I also know, well, the best way to deal with it then is to have a corporate entity, right? So now all these things are expenses. They're not just out of my pocket. And Substack happened kind of by accident. Like I said, I had friends and whatnot. And they're all writing on Substack and Substack. I'm like, okay, well, let me try it. So I start writing, and thankfully, I'm very appreciative for this. Lots of readers are like, this is awesome. So the long memo is about what's going on and why. So if you're looking for a justification, the long memo is what people want to read. That's where I do my political and economics and kind of like scholarly assessment of what's going on and why, and trying to make sense of this. Borderless living has evolved. Initially, it was called Red, White, and Fled. Okay, that was the initial name for it. Yeah, I thought it was cute too. But then I realized, that's really not the right way to look at this. Like I said to you, it's about moving towards opportunity, right? It's not running away. And so the content there is about the nuts and bolts of, how do I set up a bank account? So I went and did that. And then I wrote about it. I went to Canada, set up bank accounts. By the way, it's remarkably easy. But I did all this research. What about Europe? What about South America? What about, finance, crypto, all these? And I was like, okay, well, let me tell you everything I found out. And here's why I did what I did. And here's how you can do it. And so the paid content is really, here's how you can do the things you're worried about. You want to move your retirement overseas. Here's a place to start and understand and how to do it. You want to open, you're afraid big balls is going to roll in and blow up the Federal Reserve. Guess what? So am I. So that's why I think it's good to have money elsewhere. Okay. This is not about violating the law or doing things, secret. I mean, I used to, I joke, look, you're not Pablo Escobar. This is not about laundering money. Okay. This is about taking a more cosmopolitan view to the world and diversifying yourself in the same way that some of the wealthiest in the world do. Now, the numbers may be bigger for them, but the process is available to everyone. Okay. So long term with Borderless Living, we're going to have networks of experts that are going to help me contribute to articles. We're in the middle of finalizing one with one of the companies, which I think will be great. But I'm looking at lawyers and accountants and immigration experts because, I want to potentially move to Italy or Ireland or Canada or whatever. And that has its own challenges. But it ain't just, here's where William's going. Do you want to follow me? Other people want to go to Germany. Other people want to go to Portugal. Other people want to go to Spain. So I'm like, okay, all these places that people want to go, let me see if I can build a network of people to help those people. I'm not taking a cut. This is not like, hey guys, it's so-and-so. And today we're going to talk about moving to Spain. And this is paid for by, no. Okay, that's not my thought on this. but there is all this knowledge. There is, and more importantly, Borderless is designed to create a community where it's okay to think about these things. You're not alone. Leaving wasn't the plan, was the one that was responded to the most and caused the most emotional shock. And so many people were like, my God, thank you for putting into words the guilt and frustration I've been feeling, which has kept me from taking action. If somebody like you is this distraught over it, but says, look, I got to find options, I feel I can too.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's important
So
to
more than
understand you're
anything,
not violating
right.
anything
Yeah.
by leaving, right? You're just preserving your own sovereignty and
Exactly. And so I realized there needs to be this community of support for people who want to explore this part of themselves. It's okay to want to explore opportunity elsewhere. It's okay to want to live elsewhere. This is why I promote people like Greg and others who tell these stories of like, you know what, your world isn't going to end because you don't live in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles or wherever anymore.
Yeah.
And I think people need to hear that. Yeah. And so that's what Borderless living is about. So the long memo is the deep dive, from my years in government and as a scholar and everything else, of this is not normal, and no, you're not crazy. That's the other thing. The long memo, really, most people gravitate towards because they're like, oh my God, I'm not crazy after all. This really is like not the way it's supposed to be. No, it's not. And here's a legitimate, rational reason for why you're not crazy. Borderless living is also about, look, and you're not crazy for trying to think maybe there's better sands somewhere else. And I'm doing this, and I'm learning all these things, and I'm going to share them with you. But Borderless living is really more about the community of people that are like, is there a better life somewhere else? And the simple answer, which you already know, Simo, is yes. Potentially for you, yes.
Yeah, it's critical information, I think, for people. And I encourage everyone to check it out.
Well,
thanks again. I really appreciate you taking the time. Best of luck with your plans, and thanks for your insights here.
Thank you for having me, Simo.